You are listening to Conversations on the Way. I'm your host, Nana Jumpy, and I'm looking forward to sharing conversations at the various intersections of liberation for the people and the planet with you. Thank you for joining us. Today's conversation is at the intersection of the scramble for Africa and Black August resistance. We're talking about the conditions not being talked about on mainstream media that lay the groundwork for government overthrow. This is an issue that we, even here in the United States, need to be concerned about. We talk about it on the edges when it comes to other places where you may get your news, your analysis, your conversations. But here on KPFK, we talk about it squarely. What are the root causes of the type of disenchantment with government, with people's way of living that causes them to be open to the idea of government being overthrown? It's not something that's beyond this country, and it's something that we do service to ourselves by looking at what's happening in other countries. And so we see that when people feel disenfranchised, when people are suffering, when people are dealing with poverty, when people have a sense of hopelessness, when people feel like their needs are not being met, and when all of that is happening due to legacies of oppression that people don't want to take accountability for and don't want to address, that's what leads to people having these overthrow of governments. And so when we, of course, think about coups, we think about places like the continent of Africa, we think about some places in the Caribbean, we think about places in South America, we think about places in Central America. We don't think about this country, and so we don't learn the lessons. But here we at least get the class here on KPFK. And so we hear our brother Netfa talking so eloquently about the groundwork that has been laid by colonialism, by the French, right? The groundwork that was laid by this fake independence in which you basically had to agree to continue to be a resource by force, to continue to be a place of extraction, to continue to take a subservient position, right, in order to so-called be free. And so, like, so many threats to peace and so many threats to people power, when they do these things in the open, if we don't push back, if we don't dig in and understand better what's happening and engage in some strategies that push back and support those who are pushing back, then we doom the world to the next level of assault, the next level of violation that is going to happen. So you would think that the way that they're talking about what is happening in Niger, as well as Mali, Burkina Faso, that entire sort of Sahel region, that this is like an unexpected flash in the pan, that, it comes out of nowhere, has just landed like a spaceship in the middle of the desert, and that this hasn't actually been what we know it is, which is a long time coming. So help us to understand that, right? I mean, there's an important piece of this around the French and around France and its hold on the continent. And I think particularly for people who are listening in the United States, don't really have an understanding of the kind of hold that France has. Of course, the US is up in there too, and we'll talk about that next. But let's talk about this, no pun intended, French connection.
So I think, obviously a little historical context is in order. I won't be able to go too far back because, that's like a history class. But most people know that Africa has been subject to Western European colonization, and France was one of those colonial powers that sat at the Berlin Conference, and they all carved up and took parts of Africa. They did the same thing around the world in various points in time and various forms. And so in leading up to this, during this time that Africa was colonized, and French had its colonies, and Britain had its colonies, and Italy and Germany and all of them had their colonies. Wherever there is oppression, it breeds resistance. People don't submit willingly. And you might have some people do, but as a whole, people resist. And we know that during the 50s and the 60s, there was a wave of independence movements, national independence movements. They were calling for independence from the various colonial powers. And then also, France was no different in terms of its French colonies were calling for independence. And in the French, finally in the 50s, a lot of the France gave the independence was granted to them in September 28th, actually 1958. They held a referendum. France held a referendum of its colonies, and offered full internal self-governance, and then on certain conditions. On those conditions, really, it was just the construction of neocolonialism, all the trappings and the outward trappings of independence, but really being completely controlled by France. And they outlined these different stipulations. It was, and I can't even remember all of them. One of them was education, that you had to go through France for your education. One of them was, and very important, was the economy. And we'll get into the franc, the FCA franc, which is the currency that the former colonies, or I would say current neo-colonies of France, have to use as a currency. And then there was just so many other things they couldn't export their mineral wealth without getting permission from France. So leading up to independence, and during this, obviously we would have to talk about the development of a class, an African bourgeoisie, or petty bourgeoisie, really bourgeois class that was trained and went to school in France, and they groomed them to be the administrators of their colonies, really. And then as independence came, then it was that class that seemed to us to elevate themselves to being the at the seat of the independence, negotiating for independence. Of course, you also had revolutionary class, a revolutionary period among them. One of the interesting development in that revolutionary struggle, people may know Guinea, was led by the Sékou Touré, the PDG, People's Democratic Party of Guinea. The Democratic Party of Guinea was led by Sékou Touré. They were the only country of the French countries that voted against this fait accompli, or this ultimatum of having to submit to all this other stuff or not getting your independence. And so they gave Guinea independence, but they took everything when they said, so, okay, you don't want to submit to all this, we're going to take everything, the pen, light bulbs and all kind of stuff, and just leave you bare to try to, show them that they needed the mother countries, the colonies. But leading all the way up, I want to fast forward to the heart of your question, and the meat of your question is, during this period, all of Africa, and not just the French colonies, but also the French colonies had a very particular they had a very particular stronghold on their former colonies, as their braining, and it created because, like we said, everywhere there's oppression, there breeds resistance. We have a very revolutionized young people, and the young people in a lot of people say francophone countries, but in all the countries, but mostly in the francophone countries, the imposition of the French language, the and again the FCA, the imposition of the FCA franc, that currency that all of the countries are supposed to be, that they want them to use, and then also the militarization of the continent by the French Foreign Legion, and now also the United States. United States has AFRICOM, the U.S. Africa Command is all over the country. And in fact, the United States military footprint is larger than France, but we'll get to that. But developing during the movements, particularly within the last, I would say, like 2010 on, maybe even earlier, but 2010 on, let's say even a little bit later to 2010, you've had a very vibrant youth movement. They were able to glean from the legacies of people like Patrice Lumumba and Thomas Sankara and read things and understand more, that they didn't have to be subjected to the French domination, and that it was the French domination also, and the capitalism and imperialism. These are very anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist youth that are German, that are rising up in these countries, and they're realizing that they're suffering the poverty, the despair, the unemployment, the fact that the fact that they have these, what we refer to as the comprador class, these corrupt leaders that actually will always turn around and want some kind of third term, which is one, and also the emergence of this violent extremism, and a lot. And so these more reactionary groups that emerge, that the French Foreign Legion and the United States claim that their militaries are there to try to combat. These young people are seeing through that, and they're seeing that that they haven't combated it. The problem seems to be getting worse, and that the young people are saying, "Wait a minute, we don't agree with this," and that they've had a lot of movements and uprisings and things like that. That, strangely, ironically enough, the militaries of these countries, and we're getting ready to get right to Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, and also we might as well throw Guinea in there, that these militaries are also people, while they might get their training from AFRICOM, and the French, they can't escape the conditions that are before their eyes. They're seeing stuff. They're also, a lot of people, young people. And so some of this stuff is to spill out. And I'm not here saying that, and it's not the position of the Black Alliance for Peace to say these coups that have happened lately are revolutionary, revolutionary. They may or may not be. It's too soon to say that. We know that they're, saying, giving things like talking about Thomas Sankara and Che and Fidel, and saying that they're in solidarity. Particularly, I want to make a distinction here, particularly Mali and Burkina Faso. But right now we have the first coup d'etat happened in Mali in 2020. And they were calling for the resignation of President Ibrahim Boubacar Keita, and protests were, they were displeased with that government for a long time, and the corruption of the government, and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and the floundering economy.
You are listening to Conversations on the Way with me, your host, Nana Jumpy, and we are in conversation with Netfa Freedman, who is a co-coordinator of the Africa Project with Black Alliance for Peace. And we're talking about Niger. We're talking about those African countries of the Sahel, and this run of countries who are turning their backs on France, kicking France out, pushing to be disconnected from Western extraction in these coup after coup after coup, what the New York Times called a corridor of coups, with their attempt to be clever, that is happening across the continent. Let's think about January 6th, and let's imagine the unimaginable to most people happened, and that there actually was an insurrection, that the vote was not allowed to be certified, and that Donald Trump somehow had convinced the military to go with him, and he had been installed and made the president of the United States by force. Okay? Clearly, people would be upset. Some people would be excited. We know that. But the majority of folks, it appears from polls, etc., would not be excited and would be very upset. And even those who may be in support of Trump there may be some amongst them that at that point would be willing to say, okay, this has gone too far, right? We still are supposed to be in this country, this big democracy, and you have done something that has flown in the face of that, right? So let's say that happened. However, during this time period, people would be talking, right, and trying to figure it out. The Congress would be trying to figure it out. Supreme Court, maybe people would be filing cases because, for some reason, people think they're going to get liberation by legislation and litigation. So there probably would be bills getting pushed and court cases that would be happening to try to get some kind of statement made or some kind of policy done that would erase this. There would be maybe efforts at counter coups to get the other people in the military who were against this to rise up and to have some kind of, dang near civil war between people. But let me tell you what would be completely unacceptable. It would be completely unacceptable for people to decide in the Organization of American States, right, the OAS, that what had happened in the United States was terrible. And without any request coming from the USian people, just start planning military intervention of the United States to restore constitutional, rule. People would be alarmed to look up and see Canadian and Mexican troops coming down the street, whether that be in DC or in any other major city or even rural area of the United States, talking about we are engaging in military intervention because we don't want the United States to not be under constitutional rule. And Canada has a stake in what happens in the United States. The whole world does. But, I'm just trying to talk about the neighbors. Mexico absolutely has a stake in what's going on with the United States and whether the United States is functioning properly. But again, we all know that would be considered preposterous. No one would say, oh, this makes sense. This is a good idea. No, even those people that would want something to happen would not be looking for that something to be a war waged by foreign parties, I'm putting in quotes, in the United States of America. That is what people are discussing seriously, and more than discussing, pushing for the sovereign nation of Niger. I'm telling you, if that can happen in Niger, it can happen anywhere. This is why knowing what's going on, understanding what's going on, getting a deeper analysis of what's going on is so critical, and why KPFK is so critical. Because this is not just about people in military uniforms and having to make sure that we don't have military rules places and making sure that everyone is voting in a democracy. The US hasn't figured that out here. Some more stuff that we learn on KPFK, right? The US hasn't figured that out here. This democracy is hanging on a thread, 1 foot on a banana peel, 1 foot on the grave, while it goes around trying to deal with others. Look at what's happening in France. Their democracy, 1 foot on a banana peel, 1 foot on the grave. And so to look at another country that you are extracting from and creating the conditions that lead to political instability, that lead to a difficulty, a challenge with maintaining constitutional rule, and say, hey, we're going to encourage these other people to go on, these other countries are supposed to be your neighbors, to wage war on you until you put this back, this puzzle back into the place, or put everything back into a way that benefits us, is preposterous. That's the conversations that we have here on KPFK. That's the perspective that you get. It's not the only perspective, but at least it gets to be on the table. We also see the entry of this different kind of Pan-Africanism, which, I'm thinking also about the way that Kenya is, somehow leading the charge of this armed entry into what is happening with Haiti, allegedly for the benefit of Haiti. And we see this same push for the African Union, for the Economic Community of West African States, also known as ECOWAS, to now engage literally in war with Niger, right? So the call made to Nigeria in the name of almost Pan-Africanism. And gladly, Nigeria refused. I hear Algeria looked at that and saw that Algeria also refused. They'll keep trying other countries until they can twist someone's arm potentially into doing it. What is that about in terms of, what to me, again, is something that's been happening, but not at this level where they've literally said, look, we want you, African country, to send your military into this other African country and do our dirty work for us on that level.
Thankfully, I think that Africa has, in terms of our legacy of independence, anti-colonialism, there's this Pan-Africanism, and the spirit of Pan-Africanism is pretty strong, I think, still, despite what people may talk about the unity and all that of Africa. And so Western imperialism seems to be losing its neocolonialist grip on Africa, as we just described, and is trying to expand its use of puppets and proxies to undermine the resistance that we see formulating on the continent. And this, we just talked about the French colonies, but this is also all over. But, in terms of even in Ghana and whatnot, taking a stand against AFRICOM and different things. But I think this is what they're concerned with. And they know, because of the spirit of Pan-Africanism there, they have to really be careful when they go in and they want to they can't directly go in. So they have to use the proxies. They just to make sure that it's not, internationally, it doesn't look so bad. And maybe they can keep some control on the backlash that will come on the ground. But people are clear. I think it's really futile at this point for them to think that they can just use ECOWAS. Right now, all across the continent, and the people in the streets in other countries are saying no ECOWAS invasion or whatever and as you said, they voted against it because it seemed that wasn't going to fly. So the proxies and the compradors don't have any credibility. And I think it's the West and NATO, the what we refer to in the Black Alliance for Peace is the US, EU, NATO axis of domination. All of these, the West has nothing else to rely on. It has to resort to this. Same thing with Haiti. You mentioned CARICOM also is called itself joining Kenya in this thing to intervene in what's supposed to be the uncontrollable violence and whatnot. Africans, we can't control them. We just violent against each other, and we need masters to come in or the good Black people, Negroes that they have in their control to come in and get us straight. And that's what this is about, because they have to what they're really trying to do is avoid, they're trying to stop, they can't let us exercise self-determination and anything that's also anti-capitalist or anti-imperialist, where we can gain control of our resources and our labor and our markets.
So what should be happening? Because clearly what the road folks are on right now is a road that just leads to a deepening of all of the inequities, the divide, the suffering of people. We have this situation that has happened in Niger, where we have someone that has come into power that hasn't been quote unquote elected. What would you say, folks, what should the move be? I mean, I look at it and I think, okay, well, let's let the people decide the move. I'm not clear exactly what's happening. And if the United States gets to have its foolish leaders and all the havoc that they cause around the world, there is a question of sovereignty here that I think is important. But where are you coming from? Where is Black Alliance for Peace coming from on this? If you have a position at this point about what should be happening instead.
Yeah, we do have a position. I think it's fitting that this is also Black August, and Black August dedicated to resistance, and it's international resistance too. And I think we should also be tying, one of the things that we got to do is we got to wage mass political education around these issues, around the history of the Black radical tradition, even as far as Africa. So a Pan-Africanism, a revolutionary Pan-Africanism is necessary for us to identify with for Black Black people of African descent, wherever we are in the world, to start identifying with each other and realizing that the source of our problems, of our suffering, is the same source, is the same, and that the Black Alliance for Peace has a international in October there'll be an international month of action against AFRICOM. We have this every October. This is a fitting one because of what's happened in Niger, what's happened in the Horn of Africa and other places, in Somalia and whatnot. And so the International Month of International Month of Action against AFRICOM and to get really against all Western militarization of the continent and all forms of intervention is an opportunity for political education and action. So direct actions, whatever we can put together in terms of direct actions that link the domestic war being waged against African people, Black people in the United States with the war that the United States and its allies wages on the continent of Africa and globally. We have to begin to illuminate the interdependent geopolitical and economic interest among our people here and everywhere else in the world, and also within the domestic colonized enclaves of the imperialist countries like US and Britain and other places in France.
Yes, absolutely. If folks want to join you in that, they want to learn more about Black Alliance for Peace, they want to learn more about this month of action, where do they go?
Mm-hmm. We have our website is blackallianceforpeace.com. Blackallianceforpeace.com is the best place. We're on social media. The different handles I can't remember. I know on Twitter we're Blacks, the number 4 and Peace. Blacks plural, the number 4 and Peace is Twitter. And we're on Instagram and Facebook too. But if people just do a search, Black Alliance for Peace, we're on all the major forms of social media and just hook up. We got, when the month of action comes, we always issue like a activist toolkit. So people wherever they are in the world can use the toolkit to do political education and do direct action.
Thank you for that. So I ask you the question that I ask all of our guests, which is to fill in the blanks. We need to free ourselves of the notion of blank and lean into blank to be more free in 2023. What would you say, brother?
Oh, wow. Man, there's so many things that can go into those blanks. Okay, I'm just going to I can only pick one, right? We need to free ourselves of the notion of the reform and that we are anything but Africans, and lean into the notion or the commitment to revolution, radical transformation, and that we are one people with one destiny to be more free in 2023.
All right. That was a lot. That was good. Thank you so very much. I really, really, really appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nana.